Imagine a barren, sun-scorched hill in the dusty highlands of southeastern Turkey. The year is 1994, and near the modern city of Sanliurfa, an unassuming Kurdish shepherd is walking his flock across the dry, cracking earth as he works. His simple farming hoe suddenly strikes something hard beneath the soil. It doesn't sound or feel like a regular jagged rock. Instead, it feels incredibly smooth, like the edge of a deliberately carved stone. At that moment, it seemed like a pure coincidence, but this was no ordinary boulder hiding beneath the dirt. Little did he know, that single clink of metal against stone was about to shatter everything we thought we knew about the origins of human civilization. Within a few months, a team of experts from the German Archaeological Institute arrived to begin official excavations. As they carefully brushed away the layers of dust, they didn't just find a few ancient hunting tools. They unearthed a staggering monumental complex. Buried beneath the earth were massive T-shaped stone pillars. These weren't just simple rocks. They were monolithic giants carved from single pieces of limestone, with some towering an incredible 6 meters into the sky. Carved deep into their surfaces was a wild, three-dimensional zoo of creatures: fierce lions, slithering snakes, long-legged cranes, and charging wild boars. This level of complex artistry and engineering was supposed to belong only to much younger, advanced civilizations. But then, the radiocarbon dating results came back, and the scientific world froze. The deepest layers of this massive site dated all the way back to roughly 9,600 BC. To put that massive stretch of time into perspective, this monument was built thousands of years before the Great Pyramids of Egypt, long before the invention of large-scale agriculture, and way before any written myths existed to shape human thought. This discovery poses a mind-bending question. What does it mean when a monumental, complex religious building is created before villages, before farming, and before any state structures even existed? Why would primitive, nomadic hunter-gatherers pause their constant search for food to build an architectural marvel that required massive coordinated labor, extreme organization, and a deeply shared worldview? Welcome to Göbekli Tepe, where the silence of the stones begins to rewrite the dawn of humanity. To truly grasp the sheer impossibility of the monumental structures uncovered at Göbekli Tepe, we have to wipe away the modern world. We must strip away the concrete cities, the sprawling highways, and the dry, cracked deserts of the 21st century. We have to rewind the clock, not just a few centuries, not just to the time of the Romans or the ancient Greeks. We must travel back an incomprehensible distance, more than 11,600 years into the deep past. At this specific moment in the timeline of our planet, the Earth is experiencing a violent and magnificent awakening. For tens of thousands of years, the world had been locked in the suffocating, freezing grip of the last ice age. Massive, towering sheets of blue ice, some miles thick, had crushed much of the northern hemisphere. The global climate was locked in a deep freeze, with sea levels drastically lower than they are today, and vast stretches of the planet reduced to frozen tundras or hyper-arid deserts. But now, a profound cosmic and atmospheric shift is occurring. The global climate is rapidly warming. The great glaciers are finally retreating, cracking and calving with the deafening force of continuous thunder. Trillions of gallons of fresh, icy water are violently flooding into the oceans, altering ocean currents and reshaping entire coastlines. The planet is breathing again. It is stepping out of the frozen darkness and entering a dynamic, radically changing geologic epoch that scientists call the early Holocene. This global warming event acts as a massive trigger, completely rewriting the weather patterns of the world and bringing life-giving rain to regions that had been dry for millennia. When you stand on the Karakadag Highlands today, the wind burns your face. The region surrounding the excavation site in modern-day southeastern Turkey is a harsh, unforgiving environment. It stretches out in rolling waves of pale dust, baked rocks, and scrubby vegetation that barely survives under a merciless, scorching sun. It is a landscape that demands extreme resilience from anything trying to live there. But 11.5 millennia ago, this exact same geographic coordinate was an entirely different universe. It was not a dusty wasteland. It was a thriving, emerald-green paradise. The climate here in the early Holocene was significantly wetter, cooler, and infinitely richer. The air was heavy with moisture, carrying the rich, loamy scent of damp earth, blooming life, and frequent, heavy rainfalls. The volcanic soil of the Karakadag region, rich in essential minerals, combined with this new abundance of water to create a biological explosion. Imagine standing on that same hill, looking out across the horizon. Instead of barren limestone and dust, your eyes would meet a vast, unbroken ocean of green. Thick, ancient forests cascaded down the slopes of the surrounding mountains. These woods were dense with oak, pistachio, and almond trees, creating a thick canopy that shaded the earth below. Rivers and streams, swollen with seasonal rains and mountain runoff, carved their way through the fertile valleys, creating vibrant wetlands, sprawling marshes, and deep, cool pools of fresh water. And blanketing the open, sunlit meadows between the forests was something incredibly precious, a natural treasure that would eventually change the entire course of human history. Growing wild, densely packed as far as the eye could see, were vast, swaying fields of ancient cereal grasses. This was the untamed, original home of wild einkorn wheat and wild barley. These slender stalks, bending gracefully in the prehistoric breeze, were heavy with highly nutritious seeds. Unlike modern domestic wheat, which holds on to its seeds until harvested, these wild grasses had brittle stalks designed by nature to shatter, scattering their grains into the wind to plant the next generation. There were no plows here, no fences, no irrigation ditches, and no farmers. The earth simply provided on its own, erupting with a staggering abundance of food that returned reliably year after year, season after season. But the true pulse of this ancient world, the heartbeat of this emerald paradise, was the wildlife. The sheer volume of animals moving across this landscape would rival, and perhaps surpass, the greatest migrations seen on the plains of the Serengeti today. Scientific investigations, analyzing thousands of microscopic pollen grains trapped in the soil and thousands of ancient animal bones pulled from the excavation pits, paint a vivid, roaring picture of a hyperactive ecosystem. Picture the horizon suddenly blurring into a moving sea of brown and white dust. You feel a deep, rhythmic vibration traveling through the soles of your feet long before you hear the noise. Then comes the sound, a continuous, rolling thunder of thousands of hooves striking the earth. These are the gazelles. Massive, thundering herds of wild gazelles, numbering in the tens of thousands, swept across the plains like a living river. They were agile, lightning fast, and completely adapted to the rolling terrain, migrating in massive synchronized waves with the changing seasons to find fresh, green pastures. For any predator, human or beast, this endless tide of gazelles meant absolute survival. They were the primary source of protein. Their hides provided crucial warmth, and their bones were shaped into essential tools. Yet, the gazelles were merely the prey. Lurking in the taller grasses, wading through the marshes, and dominating the edges of the dense oak forests were creatures of immense, terrifying power. Among them were the aurochs, the gigantic, muscular, and highly aggressive ancestors of all modern domestic cattle. But you must not confuse an aurochs with a modern dairy cow. An adult male aurochs was a towering, heavily muscled beast, standing nearly 6 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing well over 2,000 pounds. They were covered in thick, dark coats and armed with massive, thick, forward-curving horns that could easily impale a lion or crush a human hunter. To stand in the presence of an aurochs was to stand in the presence of raw, untamed, prehistoric fury. They moved with heavy, deliberate steps, their deep, rumbling bellows echoing across the river valleys like distant thunder, serving as a constant reminder of the lethal dangers hiding in the tall grass. Sharing this vibrant environment were massive sounders of wild boars, heavily armored with coarse, bristly hair and armed with razor-sharp, upward-curving tusks. These aggressive scavengers rooted violently through the damp soil of the forests, churning up the earth in search of roots and tubers. Out on the drier, flatter patches of the plateau, herds of fast, incredibly resilient wild asses kicked up clouds of dust as they raced across the plains, their sharp senses always on high alert. The skies above were completely filled with massive flocks of migratory birds, while the rivers below teemed with fish and amphibians. This was the world surrounding the hill of Göbekli Tepe. It was a world of staggering, breathtaking beauty, brutal, unforgiving danger, and overwhelming natural wealth. It was a landscape that did not need to be tamed, cultivated, or controlled, because it already offered everything necessary for survival to anyone who knew how to read its signs. It was a sprawling, chaotic, and perfect Garden of Eden carved from stone, wood, and flesh. And it is within this exact, vibrant, thundering theater of nature that our story truly begins, with a highly specialized group of humans who were about to harness the energy of this wild world to do something utterly impossible. To truly understand the miracle of Göbekli Tepe, we must first completely erase the image of the primitive, grunting caveman from our minds. The people who walked this lush, prehistoric paradise 11,600 years ago were anatomically and intellectually identical to you and me. If you were to take an infant from this ancient time and raise them in the modern world, they could easily learn to fly a commercial jet or program a computer. They possessed the exact same brain capacity, the exact same complex emotions, and the exact same capacity for breathtaking genius. But instead of navigating asphalt jungles and digital networks, their supreme intelligence was entirely focused on decoding the intricate, unforgiving, and violent symphony of the natural world. These were the ultimate survivalists. They were master trackers, brilliant botanists, and apex predators who did not just live in nature. They were a seamless, hyper-aware extension of it. These early humans were nomadic hunter-gatherers. This meant they had no permanent zip code. They did not build houses out of fired brick or cut lumber. They had no defensive walls to hide behind when the sun went down, and the terrifying roars of cave lions echoed across the valleys. Instead, their lives were defined by constant, strategic movement. They lived in small, tight-knit, highly mobile bands, perhaps consisting of just a few extended families. They followed the rhythm of the seasons, tracing the massive, thundering migrations of the gazelle herds we saw earlier. When the wild einkorn wheat ripened in the highland meadows, they were there to harvest it. When the winter snows threatened the upper elevations, they packed up their lightweight shelters, likely made of woven branches and cured animal hides, and moved down into the warmer, sheltered river valleys. Everything they owned, they had to carry on their backs. This hypermobile lifestyle is exactly what makes our central mystery so absolutely baffling. These were people whose entire existence depended on traveling light and never staying in one place for too long. They possessed no concept of land ownership, no borders, and no permanent addresses. Yet, these are the very same wandering phantoms who would eventually stop, drop their packs, and collectively decide to carve, move, and erect 50-ton pillars of solid limestone. To understand how they achieved this impossible feat, we have to look closely at their hands, and more specifically, at the extraordinary technology they held within them. We often use the term Stone Age as an insult, a way to describe something crude, blunt, or backward. But there was absolutely nothing crude about the engineering of the early Holocene, because they had no metal, no iron, no bronze, no steel. Their survival depended entirely on their absolute mastery over rock. But they did not use just any rock. They sought out specific, highly valuable geological treasures, primarily a type of hard, sedimentary stone called flint, or chert. If you pick up a piece of raw flint, it looks like an ordinary dull gray or black cobble, but inside, it possesses a microscopic crystalline structure that acts very much like heavy glass. When struck with exactly the right amount of force, at the exact perfect angle, flint does not just smash into random powder. It fractures in a highly predictable cone shape, allowing a skilled craftsman to peel off razor-sharp flakes. The process of shaping this stone is known as flint knapping, and it is a breathtaking display of intuitive physics, geometry, and raw muscle memory. Imagine walking into a temporary hunting camp on the Karakadag Plateau. The air smells of wood smoke and roasting meat. Sitting cross-legged on the dusty earth is a master toolmaker. His hands are incredibly calloused, scarred from a lifetime of working with materials sharper than broken glass. Surrounding him is a carpet of shimmering, razor-sharp stone flakes. He holds a large, raw nodule of flint in one hand. This is his core. In his other hand, he holds a heavy, smooth, rounded river stone, known as a hammerstone. He doesn't just smash the core blindly, he turns it over and over in his hands, reading the invisible grain of the rock, feeling its weight, identifying the microscopic ridges and platforms. He is visualizing the tool trapped inside the stone, much like a master sculptor visualizes a statue trapped inside a block of marble. Then, with a swift, calculated, and incredibly precise motion, he strikes. Crack! A sharp, metallic sound rings out across the camp. A large, flat flake of stone peels off the core and falls into the dust. He strikes again and again. Crack! 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 With every single blow, he is manipulating the shockwaves traveling through the solid rock, guiding the fracture lines with mathematical precision. This initial stage, using the heavy river stone, is called hard hammer percussion, used to rough out the general shape of a tool. But the true genius of these ancient people is revealed in what happens next. Archaeological evidence from the workspaces surrounding Göbekli Tepe shows something truly astonishing. These ancient people weren't just hitting rocks together. They were conducting early chemical and thermodynamic experiments. Archaeologists have found flint blades that show distinct signs of heat treatment. These master craftsmen realized that if they carefully buried raw flint beneath the hot sands of a roaring campfire, slowly baking the stone for hours or even days, the intense heat would physically alter the microscopic crystalline structure of the rock. The stone would change color, often taking on a glossy reddish hue, and more importantly, it would become significantly smoother and easier to flake. This is not the behavior of primitive brutes simply surviving day to day. This is the behavior of scientific minds. People who experimented, observed, and actively manipulated the physical properties of their world to improve their technology. Once the stone was properly prepared and roughed out, the tool maker would switch to a much more delicate technique known as pressure flaking. He would set aside the heavy river stone and pick up a pointed tool, usually made from the hardened tip of a deer antler or a dense piece of animal bone. Instead of striking the flint, he would press the antler tip firmly against the very edge of the stone, applying intense, focused body weight until, snap, a tiny, paper-thin flake popped off. By repeating this process hundreds of times along the edge of the blade, he could dictate the shape of the tool down to the millimeter. The end result of this painstaking process was a masterpiece of prehistoric engineering. They created spear points designed to pierce the thick, armored hides of massive aurochs. They crafted heavy scrapers used to clean animal skins for clothing. But most importantly, they created cutting blades that possessed an edge literally sharper than a modern surgical steel scalpel. A freshly napped flint blade can taper down to a single molecule in thickness. It cuts through flesh, muscle, and sinew with terrifying, effortless ease. These beautifully retouched blades, carrying the microscopic wear and tear of repeated, precise strikes, tell a profound story. They reveal a culture of craftsmanship that went far beyond mere biological necessity. They show a deep patience, a profound mindfulness, and an inherent appreciation for beauty and perfection in the tools they created. These were not just weapons for killing. They were the finely tuned instruments that would eventually carve the breathtaking, three-dimensional animal reliefs into the monolithic pillars of Göbekli Tepe. So, when we look back at the hunter-gatherers of the early Holocene, we must see them for who they truly were. They were brilliant, adaptable, and armed with a devastatingly effective, highly refined stone technology. They understood the earth, the animals, and the very chemistry of the rocks beneath their feet. They were masters of their universe. And yet, this only deepens the mystery. Because no matter how sharp their flint blades were, or how perfectly they understood the migration of the gazelles, nothing in their nomadic, survival-driven lifestyle explains why they would suddenly decide to move mountains. What invisible force, what overwhelming idea possessed these brilliant wanderers to stop tracking the herds, drop their hunting spears, and pick up their stone chisels to build the largest, most mysterious religious monument the ancient world had ever seen? When you stand on the wooden walkways of the modern excavation site today and look down into the dug-out earth, what you see completely defies all conventional logic. You do not see a random pile of rocks or a simple circle of campfire stones. You are looking at a masterclass in prehistoric engineering. As the dust was carefully brushed away by archaeologists, the true scale of this great Stone Age construction site was finally revealed. Emerging from the earth were enormous rings made of massive stone columns. These are not rough, unshaped boulders dragged from a riverbed. These are massive, deliberately carved T-shaped stone pillars. The layout of these monuments is incredibly specific and deeply intentional. Two particularly large pillars always stand proudly right in the center of each round structure. These central giants dominate the space, commanding the immediate attention of anyone who enters. Surrounding them, forming the perimeter of the enclosure, are slightly smaller pillars. These outer stones are positioned facing inward, flanking the central monolithic giants like silent figures in a frozen, prehistoric assembly whose voices have long since faded into the dark abyss of time. The visual impact is breathtaking. The circles themselves are geometrically precise. They reveal a profound understanding of spatial awareness, symmetry, and architectural design that simply should not exist in this era. We are looking at a society of roaming hunters who suddenly decided to anchor themselves to the earth with permanent, monumental geometry. But the true shock comes when you realize exactly what these pillars are made of and how they were created. Each and every one of these gigantic pillars was painstakingly freed from a single solid block of limestone bedrock. They were not built by stacking smaller bricks on top of each other. They are monolithic, and the sheer mass of these singular pieces of stone is terrifying. Some of these pillars weigh an incomprehensible 50 tons. To put 50 tons into a modern perspective, imagine the weight of a fully loaded commercial semi-truck rolling down the highway. Or imagine a herd of 25 massive, muscular adult aurochs packed tightly together. That is the amount of dead weight these ancient people were dealing with in a single block of stone. And we must constantly remind ourselves of the ultimate, staggering paradox of this site. These builders lived in a world completely devoid of metal. They did not possess a single scrap of copper, bronze, or iron to forge hard metal chisels or heavy steel sledgehammers. Furthermore, they did not possess any domesticated draft animals, no horses or oxen, to pull heavy loads across the landscape. They had absolutely nothing but their own hands, their brilliant minds, and the very rocks beneath their feet. How does a society armed only with chipped stone manage to cut a 50-ton block out of the solid earth? The answer lies just a short distance from the magnificent circles. Only a few hundred meters away from the main complex, the natural limestone plateau reveals the scars of an ancient, massive industrial effort. This was the quarry. Limestone is a sedimentary rock born from the crushed shells and skeletons of ancient marine life that settled at the bottom of prehistoric oceans millions of years ago. Over countless millennia, extreme pressure compressed this organic matter into solid rock. Compared to something like volcanic granite, limestone is considered a relatively soft stone. But when you are staring down at a 50-ton slab of solid bedrock, the word soft loses all meaning. It is a brutal, heavy, and unforgiving material. Let us step back into the heat and dust of the early Holocene and place ourselves right in the middle of this prehistoric quarry. The sheer scale of the labor taking place here is almost unimaginable. To extract a single pillar, the master builders first had to find a flawless seam in the bedrock, a massive section of limestone free from deep natural cracks or hidden weaknesses that could cause the stone to shatter during extraction. Once the perfect section was identified, the grueling, back-breaking work began. Because they had no steel saws, they had to carve a deep, wide trench directly into the solid bedrock, slowly creating a negative outline of the massive pillar. They did this using the only hard material they had available. They used heavy flint chisels and large, dense river stones to literally pound the limestone into dust. Imagine the physical toll of this process. Hundreds of workers kneeling on the hard rock beneath the blazing, merciless sun. Every single centimeter of depth required thousands upon thousands of brutal, bone-jarring strikes. The sharp, rhythmic, metallic cracking of flint-striking limestone would have echoed across the Karakadog highlands from dawn until dusk. The impact of every blow sends violent shockwaves up the arms of the workers. Their hands are covered in thick calluses, their muscles burning with deep, agonizing fatigue. The air inside the quarry pit is choked with a thick, choking cloud of white limestone dust. This fine powder coats their skin, mixing with their sweat to form a thick, chalky paste that blinds their eyes and fills their lungs. Yet, they do not stop. They keep pounding, crushing, and scraping, millimeter by painstaking millimeter, slowly carving a trench deep enough to isolate the colossal block of stone. But cutting the sides of the pillar is only half the battle. The most terrifying and technically difficult part of the quarrying process is the undercutting. Once the rectangular outline is carved deep into the earth, the massive 50-ton block is still firmly attached to the bedrock at its base. How do you snap a 50-ton block of stone free from the planet without breaking the pillar itself? While the archaeological record leaves us to rely on educated scientific deductions, the principles of ancient physics remain the same. They likely had to pound deep, horizontal grooves underneath the massive stone. They may have driven thick wooden wedges deep into these horizontal cuts. By soaking these dry wooden wedges with water, the wood would violently expand with immense, unstoppable hydraulic force, eventually cracking the massive limestone block free from the bedrock with a deafening, earth-shaking snap. Once the stone was finally cracked free from the earth, the monumental task was still far from over. A freshly quarried block of limestone is incredibly rough, covered in jagged edges, deep gouges, and uneven surfaces. But the pillars of this great site are not rough. The builders meticulously smoothed the surfaces of the monolithic blocks. They took smaller, razor-sharp flint tools and abrasive grinding stones and went to work on the entire surface area of the 50-ton giant. They scraped, sanded, and polished the hard limestone, painstakingly erasing the violent scars of the quarrying process. This smoothing process was not just for aesthetics, it was a vital preparation. They were turning a rugged, chaotic boulder into a perfect, uniform, geometric T-shape. By grinding the limestone down to a flat, pristine surface, they were creating a massive, blank canvas. It was upon these perfectly prepared, smoothed stone canvases that their master artists would later carve the breathtaking, intricate animal reliefs that define the site today. When we look at the sheer volume of material removed from the quarry, the thousands of broken flint tools scattered across the dust, and the flawless geometric precision of the final pillars, we are forced to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth about our past. This was not a casual side project for a few wandering hunters who had some free time. The extraction and preparation of just one of these pillars required a staggering investment of human calories, time, and blood. It demands a level of long-term planning, a sophisticated division of labor, and a strict, overarching form of organization that we simply did not believe hunter-gatherer societies were capable of possessing. The quarry alone proves that these ancient people were operating with a unified, collective will that possessed the power to literally move mountains. And moving those mountains out of the quarry pit was about to become an entirely new nightmare of prehistoric engineering. Once the colossal 50-ton block of limestone was finally snapped free from the bedrock of the quarry, the master builders of Göbekli Tepe faced a terrifying reality. They had successfully carved a monolithic giant, but now they had to move it. Every single pillar had to be transported several hundred meters across the landscape to reach the main construction site. For a modern construction crew equipped with diesel-powered hydraulic flatbed trucks and heavy-duty steel cranes, moving 50 tons is a standard everyday operation. But we must strip away all of those modern conveniences and look at the bare, unforgiving reality of the early Holocene. These ancient architects did not possess a single scrap of metal. They did not have domesticated draft animals, meaning there were no teams of oxen or strong horses to bear the crushing weight. Furthermore, the wheel had not yet been invented. There were no carts, no wagons, and no axles. To make matters worse, the ground they had to cross was not a smooth, paved road. It was uneven, rocky, and treacherous terrain. Dragging a 50-ton block of rough limestone directly over raw earth and jagged rocks creates an insurmountable amount of physical friction. If you simply tie a rope to a rock of that magnitude and pull, it will not budge a single millimeter. It will simply dig a massive trench into the dirt until it becomes hopelessly stuck. So how did a society of prehistoric hunters, armed with nothing but their minds and the natural world around them, solve one of the greatest mechanical puzzles in human history? The answer lies in their profound, intimate understanding of the environment and the absolute mastery of natural materials. To overcome the crushing friction of the earth, they had to invent a mobile pathway. They looked to the dense oak and pistachio forests that blanketed the surrounding hills. Using their razor-sharp, heat-treated flint axes, teams of workers would have felled dozens, perhaps hundreds, of thick, straight trees. After meticulously stripping away the rough bark to create smooth, cylindrical surfaces, they laid these heavy wooden logs side by side along the path from the quarry to the temple site, creating a continuous track of wooden rollers. But rollers alone are useless without the mechanical force to pull the massive stone forward. How do you harness the pulling power of hundreds of humans? You need ropes of unimaginable strength. We often forget that hunter-gatherers were exceptional botanists. They possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the wild plants growing in the marshes and forests. They knew exactly which plants contained long, durable fibers. Entire communities would have been mobilized to harvest massive quantities of these tough plant fibers, drying them in the sun, and then meticulously twisting and braiding them together. By weaving thin strands into thicker cords, and then braiding those cords into massive, heavy cables, they created ropes capable of withstanding tens of thousands of pounds of sheer tensile tension without snapping. Now, imagine the staggering cinematic spectacle of the transport itself. The 50-ton T-shaped pillar is carefully levered up using thick wooden beams, and the first set of smooth logs is rolled underneath its massive belly. Thick, heavy cables of braided plant fiber are securely lashed around the stone. Extending out from the front of the pillar are long lines of thick rope, held by hundreds of strong, calloused hands. These are not slaves driven by the crack of a whip. These are highly skilled, nomadic hunters who have willingly come together, united by a deeply shared vision. A central figure, perhaps a master architect or a ritual leader, stands atop a high rock, shouting out a rhythmic, booming chant to synchronize the massive labor force. On his command, hundreds of people lean forward in perfect unison. Their bare feet dig deep into the dusty soil. Their leg muscles tremble, their backs strain, and the massive ropes pull perfectly taut, groaning under the immense stress. Slowly, agonizingly, the 50-ton giant creaks forward. As the stone rolls over the wooden logs, the logs left behind at the rear are quickly snatched up by running teams of workers, carried to the front of the massive stone, and laid down again in an endless looping track. It is a terrifying, highly dangerous ballet of raw human mechanics. A single snapped rope or a crushed wooden roller could spell instant, catastrophic disaster. Yet, inch by inch, foot by foot, they drag this monolithic mountain of stone across the uneven terrain until it finally reaches the circular enclosures. Once the pillar arrived at the construction site, the final mechanical nightmare began. They did not just leave these stones lying flat on the ground, they set them perfectly upright. Elevating a 50-ton block of stone into a vertical standing position and dropping it securely into a narrow, pre-carved socket hole in the bedrock floor requires breathtaking precision. They likely had to construct massive, temporary earthen ramps, dragging the pillar up the slope until the base hovered directly over the socket. Using a complex system of wooden levers, counterweights, and immense collective bravery, they slowly tilted the giant stone, allowing gravity to pull the heavy base down into the slot, locking the towering 6-meter-high pillar securely into the earth. However, looking at the pure physics of moving and erecting these massive stones reveals an even deeper, more complex mystery. The human body is essentially a biological engine, and heavy labor burns a staggering amount of fuel. To cut, pull, and lift 50-ton stones, you need the physical strength of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of healthy adults. If you bring a massive workforce of that size together in one place for weeks or months at a time, you immediately run into a catastrophic logistical crisis. How do you feed them? We must continuously remind ourselves that we are standing in the early Holocene. There are no vast fields of cultivated domestic wheat. There are no grain silos filled with surplus food. The archaeological record explicitly confirms this astonishing fact. At the main complex of Göbekli Tepe, there are absolutely no remains of human settlements. There are no permanent houses, no daily fire pits, and no structures meant for everyday domestic living. This was not a city, and it was not a town. So if they were not growing food, and they were not living there permanently, How did they sustain the massive caloric requirements of this prehistoric mega-project? The answer lies hidden in the soil, scattered among the magnificent stone pillars. Between the carefully placed stones, archaeologists have constantly discovered massive piles of wild animal bones, discarded flint flakes, and tiny fragments of burned materials. But these are not just a few leftover scraps from a small hunting camp. These bones are the remnants of massive, highly organized feasts. The sheer volume of bones tells a story of enormous gatherings where large groups of people congregated to share food and form a common identity. When scientists analyzed the thousands of bone fragments recovered from the site, a very specific and deliberate dietary pattern emerged. The most common species found was the gazelle, followed closely by the wild boar and the massive, incredibly dangerous aurochs. These nomadic builders did not rely on foraging for small berries to fuel their monumental construction. They organized massive, coordinated, and highly lethal hunting expeditions. Picture the surrounding valleys during the construction season. Small, highly mobile bands of hunters who normally lived entirely independent lives now joined forces. Using their intimate knowledge of the landscape, large groups of hunters would work together to corral and drive entire herds of fast-moving gazelles into natural choke points or hidden ravines. Taking down a 2,000-pound, heavily armored aurochs required even greater coordination, massive courage, and perfectly crafted flint-tipped spears. This was hunting on an industrial, monumental scale, designed specifically to yield massive, immediate calories. Once the great hunts were concluded, the high plateau of Göbekli Tepe would transform into an enormous, sprawling, open-air kitchen. The archaeological profiles are filled with heavily worn flint knives and broken spear tips, showing absolute proof of intensive, large-scale animal processing. Hundreds of freshly hunted carcasses would be brought to the site. Teams of workers would expertly skin the animals and butcher the massive cuts of meat using those razor-sharp, heat-treated flint blades. Huge, roaring fires would be built across the hillside, filling the air with the thick, rich, intoxicating smell of roasting fat and charred meat. The archaeological layers contain distinct signs of these large-scale slaughtering and cooking events, suggesting that hundreds of people participated in these massive meals simultaneously. But this was not merely about satisfying biological hunger. The consumption of these large, powerful animals was deeply intertwined with the construction of the site itself. It was a vital part of a ritual act. By hunting the most powerful beasts of the landscape and sharing their meat in a massive communal setting, these ancient people were doing something revolutionary. These colossal barbecues acted as the ultimate social glue. Some archaeologists argue that the natural mobility of these hunter-gatherer groups is precisely what allowed them to mobilize such a large labor force for short, highly intensive periods of time. They would wander the landscape for most of the year, but when the season was right, they would converge on this sacred hill. The shared effort of hunting the massive aurochs, the shared labor of dragging the 50-ton stones, and the shared joy of feasting around the massive fires forged incredibly strong social bonds. It was a grand, seasonal festival. This giant feast was the exact mechanism that allowed a society without kings, without pharaohs, and without a standing army to organize a monumental workforce. The food was the payment. The ritual was the motivation. At these massive gatherings, social boundaries blurred. Independent tribes rearranged themselves into a unified force. Ancient myths were told around the roasting fires. Old conflicts were settled, and crucial alliances were forged. This gathering was an event of exception, a place where the ordinary rules of nomadic survival were temporarily suspended to achieve something that bordered on the divine. The sheer scale of the hunting, the feasting, and the dragging of the stones proves that the builders of Göbekli Tepe were driven by a profound, collective energy, a mental and physical synchronization that would literally lay the heavy stone foundations for the future of human civilization. When we finally stand before the towering 50-ton pillars of Göbekli Tepe, successfully quarried, transported, and erected by the sheer will of prehistoric hunter-gatherers, we are immediately struck by a breathtaking realization. These massive monoliths are not merely blank structural supports. They are colossal stone canvases. The ancient builders did not just stand these rocks upright and walk away. They transformed them into the world's oldest, most terrifying, and most sophisticated art gallery. The surfaces of these monolithic giants bear incredibly intricate reliefs of wild animals and bizarre, abstract geometric signs. But we must understand that this is not simple cave painting. The artists of the early Holocene did not just use crushed berries or charcoal to draw flat lines on the rock. They utilized a staggering sculptural technique known as high relief. To create a high-relief sculpture using only flint tools, you cannot simply carve the outline of an animal into the stone. You must painstakingly chisel away the entire background of the pillar, reducing the surface level of the solid limestone by several inches, so that the shape of the animal is left protruding outward in glorious, three-dimensional perfection. This is a brutally unforgiving artistic medium. A single mistaken strike with a flint hammerstone could shatter the protruding head of a carved creature, ruining months of agonizing labor. Yet these prehistoric masters executed these carvings with flawless precision, bringing a vibrant, dangerous, and crawling menagerie of wildlife out of the dead stone. But as archaeologists began to carefully catalog the creatures depicted on these towering pillars, a chilling pattern emerged. The animals carved into the stone do not seem randomly chosen. When we examine the massive piles of discarded bones left over from their colossal feasts, we know that these people primarily hunted and ate gazelles, wild asses, and aurochs. Yet, with a few exceptions, the animals they chose to immortalize in stone were not their typical dinner. Instead, they carved their absolute worst nightmares. The pillars are completely dominated by a terrifying parade of deadly predators, venomous insects, and vicious scavengers. Slinking foxes, slithering snakes, menacing vultures, crawling scorpions, and charging wild boars appear repeatedly across the entire complex. Other pillars feature the fierce, muscular profiles of roaring lions and the elegant, long-legged strides of river cranes. Why would a society of expert hunters dedicate millions of hours of grueling labor to sculpt the very creatures that threatened their existence? To answer this, we must completely rethink how prehistoric humans viewed the natural world. For the nomadic wanderer, nature was not a beautiful park to be conquered or tamed. It was an overwhelming, unpredictable, and highly dangerous force of staggering power. A venomous snake hidden in the tall, wild wheat could end a hunter's life with a single lightning-fast strike. A scorpion lurking in a leather sleeping mat brought agonizing pain. A cornered wild boar, armed with razor-sharp tusks and thick, armored muscle, could easily disembowel a human being in seconds. By carving these dangerous animals into the sacred pillars, these people were not just decorating their space. They were engaging in a profound psychological and spiritual dialogue with the dark, untamed forces of nature. These magnificent carvings are expressions of deep reverence, profound respect, and primal fear. The animals likely represented powerful spirit beings, elemental forces, or perhaps the sacred totems of the individual nomadic groups that traveled across the region to gather at this specific hill. As excavations continued, researchers noticed something absolutely fascinating about how these animal carvings were organized. The terrifying wildlife is not distributed evenly across the site. If you walk into one specific circular enclosure, you will find that it houses almost exclusively the carvings of apex predators. Step into a different circle, and the pillars are dominated by the unsettling images of scavengers. Walk into yet another, and you will find mostly prey animals or strange hybrid creatures. It is as if every single stone ring was designed as its own unique cosmos, a distinct narrative world that may have been reserved for specific tribes or clans. Perhaps the Fox clan gathered in one circle to share their ancestral stories, while the Snake clan conducted their sacred rites in another. In a world completely devoid of written language, these towering 3D animal sculptures served as massive, recognizable badges of identity and profound mythological markers. But the stones of Göbekli Tepe do not just show isolated animals, they actually tell complex, moving stories. Some researchers have carefully tracked the patterns of these carvings and discovered what might be the absolute earliest form of a visual narrative, a sequenced sequence of images that carries a specific story within itself. On one highly specific and incredibly haunting pillar, an actual scene seems to be deliberately depicted. Carved into the limestone is a large bird, a geometric circle, and most disturbingly, a human being entirely lacking a head. Other structures feature patterns that strongly resemble protective wards or intricate tribal insignia. These are not random doodles. This is a highly developed symbolic grammar, a way of communicating profound ideas, ancient myths, and spiritual warnings through gestures, shapes, and repeated visual forms. Of all the creatures represented in this prehistoric stone zoo, there is one specific animal that commands the most attention and carries the darkest, most profound spiritual weight. It is the vulture. The vulture is not a hunter. It is the ultimate scavenger, a creature intimately and exclusively associated with death, decay, and the afterlife. When an animal or a human died on the prehistoric plains, the vultures would descend from the sky in massive circling flocks. To our modern sensibilities, the vulture is often viewed with disgust. But to the minds of the early Holocene, this majestic bird was the ultimate sacred messenger. To understand the immense power of the vulture symbol, we must look slightly forward in time to later Neolithic archaeological sites found in the same region, such as the famous ancient settlement of Çatalhöyük. In these slightly younger cultures, the vulture is explicitly and inextricably linked to a haunting, visceral ritual known as a sky burial. In a sky burial, The deceased were not placed into a wooden coffin or buried beneath the earth. Instead, the dead bodies were carried out to designated open-air platforms and deliberately exposed to the elements. The purpose was to offer the dead directly to the waiting flocks of vultures. The birds would strip the flesh from the bones, a practice known as excarnation. This was not a sign of disrespect. It was an act of profound spiritual transition. Ancient people believed that by allowing the birds to consume the physical flesh, they were successfully completing the necessary separation of the heavy, mortal body from the eternal soul. The vulture, by taking the flesh into the sky, was literally carrying the spirit of the departed up into the heavens, acting as a divine bridge between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead. When we look back at the haunting pillar of Göbekli Tepe depicting the large bird hovering near the headless human figure, a terrifying and beautiful realization washes over us. Could this monumental complex be the absolute earliest precursor to this deeply ritualistic worldview? While there are no massive graveyards or human burial pits found at the site itself, the overwhelming presence of the vulture iconography casts a long, profound shadow that reaches far beyond the hill. The ancient builders were obsessively focused on the threshold between life and death. They were utilizing the vulture as a terrifying, magnificent symbol of transformation. We are looking at a society that had not yet invented the wheel, had never planted a single seed of wheat, and possessed only chipped stones for tools. Yet, they possessed a theology and a symbolic language so incredibly complex that it allowed them to architecturally map out the journey of the human soul. They carved their deepest fears, their greatest legends, and their ultimate hopes for the afterlife directly into the living rock. But as we continue to decode the messages left upon these pillars, the animal shapes slowly give way to something even more mysterious. Hidden among the roaring lions and the circling vultures, the builders left a depiction of themselves. But in doing so, they created an abstract image of humanity that violently contradicts everything we thought we knew about the structure of prehistoric power. As we continue to decode the staggering visual messages left behind on the monolithic pillars of Göbekli Tepe, a sudden, chilling realization takes hold. For years, when archaeologists first looked at the massive T-shaped stones, they assumed the design was purely structural, a simple geometric shape intended to support a long-vanished roof. But as the blinding Anatolian sun shifted across the excavation site, casting sharp, revealing shadows into the deep grooves of the limestone, the absolute truth emerged. These 50-ton blocks of stone are not just structural supports. They carry a highly abstracted human image. To see it, you must stand at the base of the pillar and look up, imagining the horizontal block at the very top as a massive, broad head and the vertical shaft plunging into the earth as the torso. If you follow the sheer vertical edge of the stone with your eyes, you will begin to notice a subtle, deliberate, and masterful manipulation of the hard limestone. Carved in low relief, emerging seamlessly from the flat surface of the rock, are long, slender arms lying flat against the sides. As your eyes trace these arms downward, they bend at the elbow, and the hands come around to the front of the pillar, with long, carefully articulated fingers resting flat and folded together perfectly over what would be the stomach. As you look closer at the midsection of these towering stone giants, the detail becomes even more astonishing. The ancient master carvers took their razor-sharp flint tools and gouged deep, precise incisions horizontally across the stone, forming the unmistakable contours of a wide belt, indicating some form of specific clothing, or perhaps a badge of rank. Suspended from this carved belt, dropping down between the folded hands, is often the depiction of a loincloth, typically resembling the pelt of a wild fox. Some researchers analyzing these deep, purposeful cuts have even suggested they look like weapon holsters or specialized ritual garments. This is an incredibly specific, hyper-detailed representation of the human form, showcasing a breathtaking level of artistic intent. But then, you tilt your head upward to look at the face of the giant, and there is nothing. The horizontal top block, where the eyes, the nose, the mouth, and the expressions of the individual should be, is completely, terrifyingly blank. There are absolutely no faces, and there are no individual identifying features of any kind. Why would a society of master artists, people who possessed the infinite patience and supreme skill to perfectly carve the delicate articulation of human fingers and the texture of a fox pelt loincloth, completely ignore the face? In almost all later human civilizations, from the towering statues of Egyptian pharaohs to the marble busts of Roman emperors, the face is the absolute focal point. It projects ego, identity, and personal power. But the builders of Göbekli Tepe made a radically different, entirely deliberate choice. The abstraction here is incredibly striking. It appears as though the builders intentionally and systematically refused to portray any form of personal, individual identity. By leaving the stone faces blank, they created a massive, open canvas for a collective projection. A human figure without a face does not belong to any one specific person. It cannot be identified as a particular king, a specific warlord, or a wealthy elite. Instead, it becomes a universal vessel. It can carry many different roles. It becomes a representation of ancient ancestors, a towering guardian spirit, or a profound symbol of humanity itself. Perhaps these colossal, blank figures were meant to embody a form of higher, overwhelming presence that completely transcended the fragile, mortal realm of the human individual. This breathtaking artistic choice perfectly mirrors a baffling archaeological reality hidden in the dirt surrounding the pillars. When a society is capable of organizing hundreds of workers to quarry 50-ton stones, we naturally assume there must be a ruthless boss giving the orders. We expect to find the luxurious tombs of kings overflowing with gold and jewels. We expect to find grand palaces, or at the very least, a stark difference in the quality of housing between the rich elites and the poor laborers. But at Göbekli Tepe, there is absolutely zero evidence of a ruling hierarchy. There are no lavish graves of great personalities. There are no localized symbols of absolute power or domination. And there are no caches of specialized weapons that would indicate a violent enforcement of rules or internal societal conflict. The monumental pillars themselves, despite their overwhelming physical presence and undeniable grandeur, bear no individual signature. Everything within this massive complex feels purposely anonymous, as if the entire prehistoric community was actively and rigorously suppressing the ego of the individual in favor of elevating a massive, shared, collective image. Some anthropologists studying this unique phenomenon refer to it as ritual egalitarianism, a deeply ingrained social model where profound spiritual and societal meaning was strictly bound to sacred places and collective actions, rather than being hoarded by a single powerful person. This forces us to confront a paradigm-shifting concept about the origins of massive human cooperation. The builders of this site did not use whips, chains, or the threat of execution to motivate their workforce. They used shared belief. They used the absolute, unbreakable bond of a collective myth, watched over by the faceless stone ancestors they carved from the living rock. They were a society perfectly unified in purpose, lacking a king, yet capable of building a kingdom of stone. But the artistic mysteries of the pillars are only half of the story. To truly understand the incredible sophistication of these primitive wanderers, we must shift our gaze from the towering 50-ton monoliths down to the microscopic fragments hidden in the dusty soil at their bases. While meticulously sifting through the limestone rubble, archaeologists discovered tiny, glittering, jet-black fragments that seemed completely out of place in this pale, dusty landscape. These fragments were obsidian. Obsidian is an incredibly rare and fascinating geological phenomenon. It is volcanic glass forged in the superheated, pressurized belly of an erupting volcano and cooled so rapidly that no crystalline structure can form. When a master toolmaker strikes a piece of obsidian, it fractures to produce an edge that is literally sharper than a modern surgical steel scalpel. In the prehistoric world, possessing an obsidian blade was like possessing a piece of alien technology. It was an incredibly precious, highly coveted material, sought after by early cultures for its terrifying cutting power and its smooth, dark, mesmerizing beauty. But there is a massive geographical problem with finding obsidian at Göbekli Tepe. There are no active or dormant volcanoes anywhere near this limestone plateau. The Karakadag highlands cannot produce volcanic glass. So, how did these razor-sharp, jet-black fragments end up buried in the dirt of southeastern Turkey? Through advanced geochemical tracing, scientists can match the specific chemical fingerprint of an obsidian fragment to the exact volcano that birthed it. The results of these tests were absolutely staggering. The obsidian found scattered around the Göbekli Tepe complex originated from volcanic sources that were located up to 500 kilometers away. 500 kilometers. Let that immense distance sink in. We are talking about the early Holocene. There are no paved highways, no pack animals, no carts, and no wheels. A journey of 500 kilometers meant weeks, perhaps months, of brutal, unrelenting travel on foot. It meant crossing treacherous deep river valleys, navigating dense trackless forests, and surviving a landscape swarming with apex predators like cave lions and massive packs of wolves. No single hunter is going to casually walk 500 kilometers just to pick up a sharp rock. The presence of this distant volcanic glass proves something revolutionary about the people who built this site. It indicates the existence of vast, wide-ranging exchange relationships and highly complex trade networks that operated long before the very first permanent villages or walled cities were ever established. The obsidian likely did not make the journey in the hands of a single traveler. Instead, it was passed hand to hand, from one nomadic tribe to another, moving across the continent through a deeply established, continent-spanning web of prehistoric diplomacy and barter. It is absolutely fascinating to realize just how incredibly far-reaching and sophisticated these human networks must have been. The people who gathered to raise the faceless stone giants were not isolated, fearful primitives cowering in the dark. They were hyper-connected global citizens of the Stone Age. They communicated across vast distances. They traded precious commodities across lethal terrains, and they shared a collective egalitarian vision so powerful that it compelled them to build a monument for the ages. Yet, despite this breathtaking level of connectivity and artistic genius, the true heart of their rituals, the actual sounds, tastes, and visceral experiences that echoed through these stone circles, would prove to be the ultimate catalyst that accidentally changed the world forever. To truly comprehend the monumental power of Göbekli Tepe, we must step away from the bright, glaring sunlight of the modern archaeological dig. We must imagine this site as the sun sinks below the rugged Karakadag Mountains, casting the world into absolute darkness. In the early Holocene, there was no light pollution. The night sky would have been a brilliant, overwhelming canopy of stars pressing down on the high plateau. The only illumination came from the massive, roaring bonfires built within and around the great stone circles. The flickering, golden light of the flames would have danced across the towering, 50-ton limestone pillars. In this wavering light, the deeply carved three-dimensional reliefs of venomous snakes, charging boars, and leaping foxes would have appeared to physically move and writhe upon the stone. But the visual spectacle, as terrifying and magnificent as it was, represents only a fraction of the full human experience. To understand the true magnetic pull of this prehistoric wonder, we have to understand how it sounded and how it tasted. Imagine standing directly in the center of one of these massive, semi-closed circular enclosures. The architecture itself is doing something highly unusual with the air around you. Scientists and acoustic researchers who have studied the layout of these monolithic stone rings have noticed a completely fascinating physical phenomenon. The deliberate, semi-closed shapes of these massive walls and the precise positioning of the giant pillars create a very specific, highly engineered echo. When a sound is made inside one of these prehistoric rings, it does not simply vanish outward into the endless open plains of the Anatolian highlands. Instead, the sound waves travel violently outward, strike the hard, polished surfaces of the limestone, and bounce directly back into the center. This acoustic environment amplifies human voices and heavily distorts natural noises. The deep, intricate incisions of the animal reliefs are not just beautiful artistic expressions, they actually serve a functional, physical purpose by reflecting sound waves in highly complex, unpredictable ways. Because of their massive size and the specific density of the limestone, some of the great pillars seem to act like gigantic, solid stone resonance chambers. Picture hundreds of nomadic hunter-gatherers packed tightly into this enclosed space. The air is thick with the heavy smoke of burning oak and the rich scent of roasting aurochs meat. Suddenly, the rhythmic, heavy pounding of bare feet striking the packed earth begins. It is accompanied by the deep, booming thud of primitive drums, likely crafted from stretched, cured animal hides pulled tightly over wooden frames. The low-frequency bass waves of the drums hit the towering limestone pillars and reverberate directly into the chest cavities of the people standing there. Then, the chanting begins. the individual voices of hundreds of participants do not stay separate. The acoustic properties of the stone circle force those voices to merge, to melt together, transforming into one massive, overwhelming spatial experience. The architects of Göbekli Tepe had accidentally, or perhaps entirely deliberately, created an environment designed for absolute sensory overload. In this deafening, echoing, fire-lit space, the psychological boundaries between individuals completely vanished. The acoustic distortion erased individual differences, generating a profound, overwhelming feeling of a higher, unified presence. In an ancient era long before the invention of written text, when knowledge could only be passed down through breath and memory, the physical impact of sound was the ultimate invisible glue. It was a binding force that held these diverse, wandering communities together, locking them into a shared trance. But the rhythmic chanting and the booming drums were only one part of the ritual equation. As archaeologists carefully analyzed the microscopic data trapped deep within the soil, samples taken from the excavation pits, they uncovered evidence of another, highly potent element of these prehistoric gatherings. Within the dirt, they found highly unusual chemical residues pointing to the heavy presence of liquids. Specifically, these distinct chemical markers suggest the widespread use of massive containers or large ritualistic drinking vats. What kind of liquid would require massive vats at a monumental stone temple? We must look to the incredible botanical wealth of the surrounding early Holocene landscape. The fields rolling out from the hill were absolutely packed with wild einkorn wheat and wild barley. If you take these raw, wild cereal grains, crush them using heavy stone mortars, mix them with fresh water from the local springs, and leave them exposed to the open air, something magical happens. Invisible, airborne wild yeast naturally settles onto the sugary liquid mixture. This triggers a completely natural biological chain reaction known as fermentation. The yeast consumes the natural sugars present in the wild grain and converts them into two distinct byproducts: carbon dioxide gas, which causes the liquid to bubble and foam, and ethanol, which is pure alcohol. Some archaeologists and biochemical researchers strongly speculate that these early people had discovered this natural process and were actively brewing early, primitive forms of fermented beverages. This would have been a prehistoric ancestor to what we now call beer, similar to the brews later perfected by early Neolithic farming settlements. However, we must drastically adjust our modern perspective. This was not a crisp, clear, filtered beverage enjoyed casually after a long day of hunting. A prehistoric fermented brew made from wild barley would have been a thick, cloudy, highly nutritious liquid, packed with dense calories, floating grain husks, and potent wild yeast. More importantly, in the context of a society that spent its entire life surviving the brutal elements of the wild, consuming a mind-altering substance was not taken lightly. It was not seen as a simple luxury. It was recognized as a profoundly powerful, highly dangerous transition substance. Imagine the sheer physical and logistical effort required to produce this liquid. Who was responsible for carefully preparing it? Someone had to organize teams to spend days walking through the high grass, meticulously hand-harvesting enough wild grain to fill massive stone troughs. Someone had to haul hundreds of gallons of fresh water up the steep, dusty slopes of the hill. Someone had to crush the grain, monitor the bubbling vats, and protect the precious liquid while it fermented over several days. This complex, multi-step biochemical process was incredibly important to them. It was so vital that massive groups of people who otherwise lived far apart would seasonally stream together from across the entire continent just to participate. When the great feasts were held, the consumption of this primitive beer served as the ultimate social catalyst. Drinking it together was a way to instantly generate an unbreakable sense of community, to peacefully resolve deep-seated conflicts between rival hunting bands, and to deliberately induce ecstatic, visionary states of consciousness. Under the heavy influence of the fermented grain, surrounded by the deafening, echoing chants bouncing off the 50-ton pillars, the prehistoric mind was pushed far beyond the limits of everyday reality. In these heightened, altered states, the terrifying carvings of the scorpions and the vultures likely took on a vivid, breathing life of their own. The consumption of the brew did not just physically connect their bodies, it bound together their shared stories, their ancestral memories, and their wildest, most terrifying visions into a vast, unbreakable network of spiritual meaning. They were creating a mental landscape so incredibly powerful that they felt an absolute compulsion to capture it, to carve it permanently into solid stone, before the visions faded and were lost forever to the wind. This combination of massive acoustic engineering, monumental sculpture, large-scale hunting, and the brewing of psychoactive liquids created an unprecedented vortex of human energy. Göbekli Tepe was not merely a building. It was a perfectly designed prehistoric machine built specifically to alter human consciousness and forge massive societal bonds. And it is right here, in the hazy, chaotic, and loud center of these incredible stone circles, that a spark was ignited. It was a spark that would accidentally trigger the single most profound, earth-shattering revolution in the entire biological history of our species. The absolute necessity to maintain these massive, roaring festivals was about to force the ultimate hunters of the wild to do the unthinkable. They were about to bend the very laws of nature to their will. As the booming echoes of the primitive drums faded into the dark Anatolian night, and the massive, roaring bonfires slowly burned down to glowing embers, the prehistoric festival-goers faced a harsh and unforgiving biological reality. The sheer, terrifying scale of these monumental gatherings created a massive logistical nightmare. We have established that the construction of the giant 50-ton pillars required the immense physical labor of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of individuals. We also know that to fuel this staggering workforce, they hosted colossal open-air feasts, consuming massive quantities of heavily armored aurochs, fast-moving gazelles, and thick, intoxicating vats of wild, fermented grain beer. But when you suddenly bring thousands of apex predators, human beings, into one highly concentrated, specific geographic location, you place an overwhelming, catastrophic strain on the local ecosystem. Nature is infinitely bountiful, but it is not completely limitless. In the early Holocene, the rolling Karakadag highlands were a lush, emerald paradise, teeming with wildlife. But even this staggering abundance could not sustainably support a massive, localized population explosion year after year. Imagine the immediate environmental impact of these monumental construction seasons. Thousands of hungry builders and their families scouring the surrounding hillsides every single day. The fast, agile herds of gazelles, realizing they were being hunted on an unprecedented, industrial scale, would quickly learn to alter their ancient migration routes, steering far clear of the noisy, smoke-filled skies above the stone circles. The massive, muscular aurochs would retreat deeper into the dense, impenetrable oak and pistachio forests to avoid the organized, lethal hunting parties. Furthermore, the vast swaying fields of wild einkorn wheat and wild barley, which were absolutely crucial for baking primitive breads and brewing the massive vats of ritualistic beer, would be rapidly stripped completely bare. The ancient builders were caught in a terrifying, inescapable trap of their own making. The sacred rituals that brought massive crowds together demanded immense amounts of food, complex supplies, and strict organization. They could not simply pack up and abandon the 50-ton, perfectly carved limestone pillars that they had bled to drag across the earth. The monumental temple demanded to be maintained, and the powerful, hallucinogenic rituals demanded to be continued. But the wild, untamed environment could no longer provide enough calories to sustain the sheer magnitude of their spiritual ambition. They were staring directly into the face of mass starvation, right in the shadow of their greatest architectural triumph. It is precisely at this terrifying crossroads of spiritual desperation and biological hunger that the absolute most earth-shattering revelation of Göbekli Tepe emerges. To fully comprehend the sheer magnitude of this discovery, we must take a moment to look at the traditional, established textbooks of human history. For generations, scientists, historians, and archaeologists were completely united in their understanding of how human civilization began. We were all taught a very specific, linear timeline known as the Neolithic Revolution. The traditional textbook story goes exactly like this. First, primitive, wandering hunter-gatherers somehow, by sheer accident or slow observation, figured out how to plant seeds in the ground and grow their own food. This invention of agriculture was the ultimate turning point. Because they had to tend to their crops, they stopped wandering and settled down, building the very first permanent villages and farming communities. Because farming is highly efficient, it created a massive surplus of extra food. For the first time in human history, not every single person had to spend their entire day desperately searching for calories. This incredible surplus of food created free time, and with this newly found free time, society could afford to support specialized workers, people who did not farm, but instead became full-time priests, master artisans, and brilliant architects. According to the traditional textbook, it was only after all of these crucial steps were completed that humanity finally possessed the resources and the organization to build monumental temples and complex religious structures. Agriculture was the spark. The temple was the final glorious result. But then, the dusty, wind-swept hill in southeastern Turkey was excavated, and this entire, universally accepted timeline was violently ripped apart. The monumental stone circles of Göbekli Tepe shatter our established understanding of the past because they were built entirely backward. We are standing inside a complex, mathematically precise, artistically sophisticated temple that was constructed by highly mobile people who did not have a single farm, did not have a permanent village, and did not possess a surplus of domesticated food. The timeline is not just slightly off, it is completely inverted. Faced with this impossible paradox, some researchers and brilliant minds in the archaeological community dared to propose a radical, breathtaking new thesis. They argued that the textbook is entirely wrong. agriculture did not make the building of temples possible. Instead, the overwhelming, desperate need to build and maintain the temple is exactly what made agriculture absolutely necessary. The monumental temple was not the luxurious final product of a comfortable farming society. It was the ultimate driving trigger that forced humanity to invent farming in the first place. This theory proposes that the sheer gravitational pull of this sacred site was so incredibly strong that it changed human behavior forever. When the wild herds of gazelles vanished and the wild fields of wheat were picked clean by the massive festival crowds, the builders refused to let their sacred rituals die. Instead, they took the ultimate, unprecedented leap. They realized that they could no longer rely on the unpredictable, chaotic whims of nature. They had to take absolute control of their food supply. It is here, in the direct shadow of the roaring fires and the towering, faceless stone giants, that people first began to intentionally collect, carefully cultivate, and deliberately shape wild grains. If this radical theory sounds too incredible to be true, we only need to look at the absolute, undeniable proof hidden deep within the microscopic DNA of the plants themselves. Just a short, walkable distance from the massive stone circles of the excavation site rises the rugged, volcanic massif of the Karakodag Mountains. In recent years, highly advanced teams of geneticists and botanists embarked on a massive global project to map the entire genetic lineage of modern domesticated wheat. They took samples of the wheat we use today to bake our bread and make our pasta, and they traced its genetic markers backward through thousands of years of human history, desperately searching for the absolute original, absolute first strain of domesticated wheat on the planet. The results of this massive genetic mapping project provided a smoking gun of unimaginable historical proportions. The genetic trail did not lead to the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, and it did not lead to the ancient valleys of Egypt. Investigations at the Karakodag Massif proved definitively that the absolute earliest genetic precursors of today's modern wheat were found right there, growing wild on the slopes overlooking Göbekli Tepe. Out of the entire massive, sprawling expanse of the planet Earth, the very first place where humanity successfully manipulated the genetics of a wild plant to create a reliable, domesticated crop is situated astonishingly close in time and geography to the building phase of this monumental sanctuary. This was not an overnight miracle. It was a slow, grueling, and deeply intentional process of artificial selection. Wild einkorn wheat is biologically designed by nature to be incredibly fragile. When the seeds are ripe, the stalk becomes brittle and shatters at the slightest touch of the wind, scattering the grain across the earth so it can reproduce. This is brilliant for the plant, but an absolute nightmare for a hungry human trying to harvest a massive quantity of food. But occasionally, a random genetic mutation occurs in a wild wheat plant, causing the stalk to remain tough and hold on to its seeds even when fully ripe. In the wild, this mutant plant would normally die out because it cannot drop its seeds to reproduce. But the desperately hungry builders of Gobekli Tepe noticed these rare, tough-stalked mutant plants. They realized that if they selectively gathered only these specific seeds, carried them closer to their gathering sites, cleared the earth, and intentionally planted them in the soil, they could create entire fields of wheat that waited patiently to be easily harvested. They were actively hacking the biological code of the planet. They were transforming a wild, unpredictable grass into a highly efficient, controllable biological machine designed specifically to fuel their massive workforce and sustain their towering, sacred stone circles. This monumental transition marks the absolute, definitive point of no return for our species. For hundreds of thousands of years prior to this moment, human beings were completely subjugated by the environment. Humans, who were once wandering hunters moving strictly in the ancient, unbroken rhythm of nature, suddenly stepped out of the food chain. They began to actively shape, meticulously plan, and ruthlessly tame the wild world around them. They stopped adapting to the earth, and they forced the earth to adapt to them. This breathtaking realization means that Göbekli Tepe is not just an ancient building. It is a profound, earth-shattering transitional phenomenon. It is the exact, specific geographic coordinate where an old, ancient world of wild hunters permanently died, while a completely new, modern world of farmers and civilization was violently and brilliantly born. The implications of this are almost too massive to fully comprehend. It proves that if deep spirituality, ancient myth, and powerful collective symbolism provided the ultimate impulse to physically change the nature of the planet, then the true, absolute origin of modern human civilization was not primarily driven by economic necessity, but by a profound, overwhelming ritualistic and religious desire. The human soul demanded a temple, and the human hands were forced to invent the modern world to pay for it. For thousands of years, the monumental stone circles of Göbekli Tepe stood as the undisputed center of the prehistoric world, a booming, fire-lit beacon of human unity and spiritual power. But the Earth is a chaotic, restless engine, and the climate of our planet is never permanently stable. The early Holocene epoch, which had initially transformed the region into a lush, emerald paradise, was characterized by violent, unpredictable atmospheric fluctuations. The golden age of the hunter-gatherer was living on borrowed time. As the centuries slowly marched forward, approaching the critical threshold of roughly 9,000 years before Christ, the global climate began to undergo a massive, devastating shift. The endless, heavy rains that had fed the mighty rivers and sustained the thick wetlands began to fail. A long, punishing period of severe drought settled over the Anatolian plateau. The once vibrant landscape began to bake under a merciless, scorching sun, drastically altering the fragile balance of survival. The ecological transformation was brutal and undeniable. The massive, sprawling forests of oak, almond, and pistachio trees, which had once provided endless canopies of shade and massive bounties of nuts, could no longer survive the creeping aridity. Deprived of deep groundwater, the dense tree lines slowly began to retreat, shrinking back into the isolated, sheltered valleys. The endless oceans of tall, green grasses turned a brittle, dusty yellow. And as the vegetation withered, the true catastrophe struck. The massive, thundering herds of wild animals, the absolute lifeblood of the nomadic hunters, could no longer find enough forage to sustain their massive numbers. The endless rivers of agile gazelles, once so plentiful they darkened the horizon, began to thin out and disappear. The towering, muscular aurochs, which required immense amounts of water and grass to survive, were forced to abandon the drying plains. This devastating environmental collapse completely shattered the logistical foundation of the Great Temple. We must remember that the monumental gatherings at Göbekli Tepe were entirely fueled by industrial-scale hunting. When the environment rapidly transformed, forcing humans to adapt to a newly impoverished landscape, the grand feasts became physically impossible. The archaeological record from this transitional period reveals a desperate, grim reality. In the younger layers of dirt, the massive bones of large prey are replaced entirely by the delicate, tiny skeletons of small, skittish creatures, like wild hares and small deer. You cannot feed an army of thousands of stone-carving pilgrims with a handful of rabbits. A sanctuary originally designed for colossal, collective celebrations simply cannot function when the entire population is staring down the barrel of mass starvation. Faced with this terrifying ecological pressure, the nomadic bands had to make a desperate, permanent choice. They could no longer rely on the unpredictable whims of a dying, drying, natural world. They were forced to fully commit to the biological experiment they had started in the shadow of the stone pillars. They turned all of their energy toward the mutant, tough-stalked wild wheat they had begun to cultivate. The botanical evidence from the soil of this era tells an incredible story of artificial selection and complete human domination over nature. The microscopic seeds found in the younger archaeological layers are distinctly larger, heavier, and completely different from their wild ancestors. Their outer husks had physically changed, fundamentally altered by generations of humans selectively planting and harvesting them. The human being was no longer just a participant in the natural cycle. The human being had become the absolute master and shaper of the biological world. But this miraculous agricultural triumph came with a heavy, irreversible price. You cannot plant a massive field of highly valuable, life-saving wheat and then simply walk away to follow a migrating herd of deer. A farmed field requires constant, back-breaking labor. It must be fiercely protected from wild scavengers, swarms of insects, and rival, starving human tribes. To protect their newly engineered food source, the eternal wanderers were forced to stop walking. They had to drop their lightweight, temporary leather tents and anchor themselves permanently to the dirt. They were forced to invent the very first permanent villages, forever changing the psychological and physical landscape of humanity. Just a few miles away from the silent, starving stone circles of Göbekli Tepe, a completely new type of human habitation began to violently scar the earth. We see the dramatic rise of early permanent Neolithic settlements like Nevaluchori and Chayonu. In these new, bustling villages, the ancient architects did not carve monolithic limestone pillars. Instead, they took the wet mud from the riverbanks, mixed it with dried straw from their wheat harvests, and baked it in the scorching sun to create thousands of heavy, identical bricks. They used these mud bricks to construct something that had never existed in the history of the world: permanent, solid walls. This architectural revolution represents a massive, earth-shattering shift in human psychology. If you look at the ancient, sacred rings of Göbekli Tepe, the architecture is entirely circular. A circle has no beginning and no end. It possesses no corners to hide in, no specific direction, and no rigid boundaries. A circular space naturally fosters a feeling of absolute equality, endless flow, and deep, boundless connection to the surrounding cosmos. But when the new farmers built their villages, they completely abandoned the circle. The new mud brick houses at Sayonu and Nevaluchori were strictly rectangular. Rectangular architecture is not merely a different way of stacking mud. It is a completely different way of thinking. A rectangle is designed for pure mathematical efficiency. You can pack rectangular houses tightly together in a grid. You can easily add more square rooms, dividing a single structure into highly specific, separated living quarters. Most importantly, a rectangular wall creates a harsh, absolute division of the universe. It creates a definitive inside and a definitive outside. It establishes a physical, undeniable barrier between the wild, unpredictable chaos of nature and the controlled, structured safety of human domestic life. With the invention of the solid wall and the locked door, a dark and powerful new concept infected the human mind. The world of the nomadic hunter was fluid and shared. The land belonged to no one, and the meat from a hunted aurochs was divided equally among the entire tribe to ensure mutual survival. But the sedentary world of the farmer is defined by deep, absolute claims of ownership. When you spend months breaking your back to plow a field, carry water, and harvest grain, that grain belongs exclusively to you. The early villagers built deep, secure grain silos to hoard their massive caloric surpluses. They constructed heavy animal pens to permanently trap and control early domesticated livestock. They erected physical fences to mark the absolute borders of their newly claimed territory. For the very first time in the history of our species, the concept of personal property was born. And where there is personal property, inequality instantly follows. In a farming village, some families inevitably harvest more wheat than others. Some manage to breed larger herds of goats or sheep. The massive surplus of food becomes a new, incredibly potent form of wealth. Wealth creates leverage, and leverage creates raw, unadulterated power. The perfect communal egalitarianism that had built the 50-ton pillars of Göbekli Tepe was violently ripped apart by this new economic reality. The ancient society of equals shattered, rapidly mutating into a rigid system of deep social stratification. Suddenly, there were the wealthy and the poor. There were the powerful landowners and the desperate laborers. The absolute necessity for agricultural survival had accidentally birthed the concept of the ruling class, setting the stage for the warlords, kings, and emperors of the future. This massive societal earthquake is perfectly documented in the evolving art and religious practices of these new permanent villages. The symbolic universe was shrinking, pulling away from the grand cosmic forces of nature and plunging directly into the obsessive glorification of the individual human ego. At Göbekli Tepe, the towering, majestic stone pillars were deliberately carved without faces. They represented anonymous collective spirits or universal ancestors, firmly denying any single human the right to claim ultimate importance. But in the dark, rectangular rooms of the new agricultural settlements, a chilling new religious obsession emerges. In the domestic cult buildings of Nevalachori, archaeologists suddenly discover carefully modeled, highly detailed human heads. These clay and stone sculptures possessed distinct, individualized facial features. They were no longer anonymous. They were representations of specific, powerful individuals. Even more disturbing, clear physical evidence of gruesome, individualized ancestor worship begins to appear in the dirt. Human graves are found beneath the plastered floors of the rectangular houses, indicating a desperate need to keep the dead trapped within the boundaries of family property. In some settlements, the skulls of the deceased, were physically separated from the skeletal body, entirely coated in thick clay, painted with vivid colors to recreate facial features, and proudly displayed on shelves inside the homes. The definition of the sacred had completely relocated. It was no longer found out in the open, communal circles beneath the terrifying starry sky. The sacred was now locked indoors, violently tied to the physical human body, the individual ego, and the inherited bloodline of the wealthy property owner. Humanity had successfully conquered the wild landscape, but in doing so, they had walled themselves off from the ancient, boundless magic of their ancestors. The open, fluid, and profoundly connected world of the early Holocene hunter-gatherers was completely dead, crushed beneath the sheer weight of mud bricks, grain silos, and the endless, exhausting grind of agricultural labor. But out on the dry, dusty high plateau, the massive limestone pillars of Göbekli Tepe still stood in deafening silence, casting long, haunting shadows across the dying grass. The great temple was a colossal, undeniable monument to a way of life that no longer existed. It was a terrifying 50-ton reminder of a world without borders, without kings, and without property. For the new generation of wealthy farmers and rising village elites, this ancient, towering sanctuary was not just an outdated relic. It was a massive, dangerous ideological threat to their newly established, unequal social order. And they were about to launch a staggering, unimaginable engineering operation to ensure that the dangerous memories held within those stone circles would be completely erased from the face of the earth. As the early Holocene climate continued to dry and the newly minted farmers locked themselves behind the heavy mud brick walls of their permanent settlements, a profound and dangerous ideological canyon opened up within the human mind. Down in the valleys, the new world was rapidly taking shape. It was a world entirely defined by harsh, rectangular boundaries, the desperate accumulation of wealth, and the sudden, violent emergence of social hierarchy. But high up on the dusty, wind-swept Karakadag plateau, the towering 50-ton limestone pillars of Göbekli Tepe still stood. These monolithic giants were a glaring, undeniable monument to an ancient, egalitarian universe that no longer existed. They represented a vast, open, and fluid worldview that was deeply rooted in the endless, cyclical rhythms of wild nature. A worldview that had absolutely no concept of private property, land ownership, or ruling elites. For the rising class of wealthy village landowners and powerful agricultural chieftains, this ancient, sprawling sanctuary was not merely an obsolete relic of a forgotten era. It was a massive, highly visible, and deeply dangerous ideological threat. How can you convince a population to accept strict social inequality, backbreaking agricultural labor, and the absolute authority of a ruling class when the greatest, most majestic architectural triumph in the entire world sits just over the horizon, silently proving that humans can achieve impossible miracles through pure equality and shared communal will? The sweeping, directionless circles of Göbekli Tepe directly contradicted the harsh, straight lines and locked doors of the new farming reality. The old world of the hunter was simply too vast, too uncontainable, and too radically free to fit inside the cramped, suffocating architecture of the early agricultural mind. Faced with this massive, irreconcilable paradox, the descendants of the original builders realized that the great temple could no longer remain open to the sky. The ancient sanctuary had to be neutralized. But what happened next defies all logical expectations of human conquest and regime change. Throughout the bloody, turbulent history of human civilization, when a new religion or a new political power takes over, they almost always violently obliterate the sacred monuments of the previous era. They smash the statues of the old gods, they burn the temples to the ground, and they proudly build their own conquering palaces directly on top of the smoking ruins. But at Göbekli Tepe, there is absolutely zero evidence of violence. The archaeologists found no signs of a desperate final battle, no crushed skulls, no burned wooden beams, and no toppled, shattered pillars. Instead, they uncovered the physical remnants of an unimaginably massive, deeply emotional, and profoundly respectful operation. The ancient people did not destroy their ancestral masterpiece. They carefully, deliberately, and painstakingly buried it. Try to visualize the sheer, staggering magnitude of this prehistoric undertaking. We are talking about circular enclosures that span dozens of meters across, featuring monolithic pillars that plunge deep into the bedrock and soar 6 meters into the air. To completely bury just one of these massive rings requires an incomprehensible volume of material. The ancient people had to move thousands upon thousands of tons of earth, limestone rubble, discarded flint tools, and animal bones from the surrounding landscape. They had no heavy machinery, no metal shovels, and no wheelbarrows. Every single ounce of that fill material had to be scraped from the dry earth by hand, loaded into woven baskets or animal hide sacks, carried on the backs of human beings, and poured into the sacred enclosures. The physical effort required to fill in these massive pits was nearly as monumental as the effort required to build them in the first place. Yet, the archaeological profiles of the dirt reveal that this was not a chaotic, frantic dumping of garbage. It was an incredibly controlled, structured, and almost loving act of concealment. The materials were layered purposefully, stacked gently around the towering stone giants. It was an act of ritual closure, a breathtakingly gentle funeral for an entire world view. As the baskets of dirt rained down, slowly covering the deeply carved reliefs of the terrifying scorpions, the roaring lions, and the sacred soul-carrying vultures, an entire chapter of human existence was deliberately plunged into total darkness. Why did they choose to bury it rather than simply abandon it to the wind and the rain? In many ancient cultures, the act of burying a highly charged sacred object or a powerful ritual space is not meant to signify its destruction, but rather its ultimate transformation. A burial protects the immense, lingering power of a site, ensuring that its ancient magic cannot be misused, distorted, or completely corrupted by the generations that follow. The new agricultural society may have felt a deep, primal terror toward the raw, untamed forces that their ancestors had summoned within those echoing stone walls. They knew that the old rituals, rooted in the wild, chaotic rhythms of the hunt, were completely incompatible with their new, rigid lives built upon plowing fields and hoarding grain. By entombing the 50-ton pillars, they were symbolically closing a massive, terrifying door to the past. They were definitively drawing a heavy line in the sand, officially marking the absolute end of the early Holocene hunter-gatherer era and securing the permanent dominance of the new agricultural reality. Once the final baskets of limestone rubble were poured over the tops of the highest pillars, sealing them completely beneath the surface of the earth. An eerie, overwhelming silence fell over the Karakadag Plateau. The bustling, roaring, fire-lit epicenter of prehistoric humanity was instantly transformed into just another unremarkable, dusty hill in the Anatolian highlands. And as the decades turned into centuries, and the centuries bled into millennia, the most successful and chilling part of this monumental burial was finally achieved: the absolute, total erasure of memory. As the early farming villages slowly evolved into the massive, sprawling, walled cities of ancient Mesopotamia, giving birth to the world's first true empires, the mighty Sumerians, the Akkadians, and the Babylonians began to write down their own histories. They invented cuneiform script, and they pressed their elaborate dramatic origin myths into clay tablets. These later, highly advanced civilizations spun grand, sweeping tales of powerful warrior gods descending from the heavens to grant humanity the miraculous gifts of agriculture, law, and kingship. They built massive, towering ziggurats and claimed that human civilization only began when the very first divine king sat upon his golden throne. In all of these sprawling, epic mythologies, there is absolutely zero mention of a time before kings. There is no written memory of a deeply egalitarian society of brilliant, nomadic hunters who moved 50-ton stones with their bare hands. The ruling elites of these new, highly stratified empires desperately needed to legitimize their absolute power. They needed their terrified subjects to believe that social inequality, grueling taxation, and brutal class division were the natural, divine, and unchangeable order of the universe. An ancient, lingering memory of a magnificent, monumental society that functioned perfectly without a single ruler, without a single slave, and without a single locked door was an incredibly dangerous concept. The silence surrounding Göbekli Tepe is not an accident of time. It is the breathtaking result of a deliberate, systematic cultural suppression. History is always written by the victors, and the ultimate victors of the early Holocene were the farmers, the property owners, and the emerging kings. They did not just bury the stones of the temple, they ruthlessly buried the very language, the sweeping narratives, and the boundless egalitarian ideals that those stones were carved to represent. They successfully overwrote the story of human origins, replacing the wild, shared magic of the hunter-gatherer with the strict, punishing laws of the agricultural state. For more than 11,000 years, the great artificial hill stood perfectly silent beneath the blazing sun and the freezing winter snows. Empires rose to staggering heights and collapsed violently into dust. The Bronze Age gave way to the Iron Age. Mighty Roman legions marched across the ancient world, and the modern industrial era eventually paved over the planet with asphalt and steel. And through it all, the faceless stone giants waited patiently in the dark, clutching their carved limestone bellies, acting as the ultimate perfectly preserved time capsule of our forgotten wild infancy. They waited for a time when humanity might finally be ready to dig through the dirt, break the ancient silence, and confront the beautiful, terrifying truth about exactly who we used to be and exactly what we sacrificed to become modern. As we stand on the wooden walkways today, looking down into the massive, excavated pits of Göbekli Tepe, the blinding Anatolian sun casts long, heavy shadows across the faceless stone giants. This is not merely an archaeological site filled with dead rocks and broken tools. It is a profound, earth-shattering mirror, reflecting a version of humanity we completely forgot ever existed. For generations, we comfortably believed that the story of human civilization was a simple, straight line. We believed that we slowly crawled out of the wild, planted a few seeds of wheat, built walls, and eventually found the intelligence and the social order to create magnificent art and towering temples. But this dusty hill in southeastern Turkey has violently rewritten that entire narrative. Göbekli Tepe proves that before the walls, before the kings, and before the plows, humanity possessed a breathtaking capacity for supreme artistic genius, monumental engineering, and profound, peaceful cooperation. The temple did not come at the end of our journey into civilization. The temple was the very spark that ignited the modern world. Yet, as we marvel at the intricate, three-dimensional reliefs of the vultures, the charging boars, and the terrifying, crawling scorpions, we must confront a truly staggering reality. Everything we have seen, everything that has completely turned the scientific and historical world upside down, is merely a tiny scratch on the surface. Ground-penetrating radar surveys and meticulous geological testing have revealed an absolutely mind-bending fact. More than 90% of this massive, artificial hill remains completely untouched, locked away beneath thousands of tons of dirt. Let that massive scale sink in. We have only excavated a fraction of this prehistoric masterpiece. Lying silently in the dark, suffocating Earth directly beneath the feet of the archaeologists, are potentially dozens more circular enclosures. There are hundreds of undiscovered monolithic pillars, unread stone canvases holding the lost myths, the deepest fears, and the forgotten memories of the early Holocene. What exactly is waiting down there in the darkness? Will the next layer of excavation finally reveal the definitive missing link that explains exactly how the open world of the hunter transitioned into the locked world of the farmer? Will we find the smoking gun that explains why the site was so carefully, deliberately buried and erased from human memory? Or will the next strike of a trowel unearth something so radically unexpected that it shatters our newly formed theories all over again, forcing us to rewrite the history books a second time? The ultimate power of Göbekli Tepe does not just lie in the solid, limestone answers it has grudgingly surrendered to the light. Its true, terrifying power lies in the massive, echoing questions it forces us to ask ourselves. If the foundations of human civilization are vastly older, infinitely more complex, and far more mysteriously layered than our traditional stories allow, how much of our own identity is built on a forgotten past? This site is a silent teacher, reminding us that progress is not a straight line, but a massive, buried spiral of forgotten eras, lost triumphs, and deliberate silences. Why do you think our ancient ancestors went to such agonizing, back-breaking lengths to deliberately bury this magnificent wonder? Were they desperately trying to protect their most sacred, ancient magic from an approaching physical or cultural disaster? Or were they ruthlessly trying to hide a terrifying secret from the generations that would follow? Let us know your deepest theories and thoughts down in the comments below. If you found this mind-bending journey back 11,000 years fascinating, and you want to continue exploring the darkest, most mysterious corners of our ancient past, do not forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Thank you for walking through the dust and time with us today, and we will see you on the next journey into the unknown.